Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the 2024 Senate elections, and I'll be talking about the Rust Belt Blue Wall states. We'll be focusing on Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and discussing the developments that have occurred in these races over the course of the past few weeks. So, in case you've missed it, Republicans have had really good news across these three races. They've started to get polling leads, and they've come closer in the averages by a significant amount, which I'll be showing you all in a second. But first, let's talk about these races as a whole. Democrats need to win all three of these seats if they want to even have a chance to win the Senate majority. Why? Well, let's say they do win all three, right? They're only at 46, so they have to win all three of these, and even then, they still have to win at least four more seats. And those four seats are going to likely have to come in Nevada, in the form of Nevada, Arizona, and then two of these remaining five. So obviously, that is going to be interesting to watch. I think Democrats realistically can get to 48, but to get to 49 or 50 or 51 or however many seats Democrats can win in a best case scenario is going to be difficult. So the Rust Belt's important. Republicans obviously I think can win the Senate majority pretty early on election night if they just win one of these Rust Belt states, because even if they lose all the other even competitive seats, like say they win Wisconsin, but even lose Ohio, they would still have to lose Montana and Texas, or Montana and Florida, or Texas and Florida to lose the Senate majority. So one of these Senate seats flipping red would essentially be good night for Democrats and for any Democratic majority in the Senate for the next 2 years. So let's talk about it. We're going to start in Wisconsin, and actually, we'll start in Wisconsin, but I do just want to kind of show these results just on their own here, so we can kind of take a look at what's been happening. Let's see if this is going to work for me. Here we go. So in Wisconsin, again, we saw Tammy Baldwin had a 6-7 point lead in August. That's down to 2%. In Pennsylvania, Bob Casey led by as many as 7 back in the spring. He was up by 8 in August. He's now up by 3. And in Michigan, Alessa Slotkin, I think this is still the best for Democrats because she peaked at 5 and she's still up by a little under 4. But we've seen Republican movement in all of these races. Now, we're going to start in Wisconsin. And Wisconsin is going to be interesting to watch because this is, I think, the race that Republicans have the best chance of winning. Wisconsin, to me, is a state that of these three Rust Belt states, Trump has the best chance of winning. His polling there is okay. He's doing a bit better in Pennsylvania, but a bit worse in Michigan than Wisconsin right now, if you believe the polling. But polling aside, because we're going to talk a lot about that in this video, fundamentally, what do we know about Wisconsin? It is more rural than Michigan or Pennsylvania. It is more white than Michigan or Pennsylvania. And the Democratic incumbent in Wisconsin, I think, is actually the least battle-tested compared to Slotkin, who's not an incumbent in Michigan, and Casey, who's the incumbent in Pennsylvania. Now, Tammy Baldwin is a very good incumbent. Don't get me wrong about that. However, in 2018, Republicans did not really contest her. She won by 11, which was an amazing performance, but Republicans left town. They did not invest in beating her. This time with Eric Hovde, Republicans are investing. And I think that, they're starting to invest now that they actually see close polling numbers in the state. And we've actually seen that the delta that exists between Tammy Baldwin and Kamala Harris in Wisconsin has began to close. And what I mean by that is that if you look at the polls from August or early September, we saw pretty big deltas between Baldwin and Harris. We saw Baldwin doing 4, 5, 6% better than Harris in many of these polls. What we now see is that that delta is smaller. It's really only 1 or 2 points in most polls. And in the averages, if we take a look at the average in Wisconsin, Baldwin's up by 2 and Harris is up by a little less than 1. So we only really have about a 1 point delta on average now. And that's significantly down from what it was in, say, August or September. If we go back to the end of August, let's see here. Tammy Baldwin was up by 6, right? Harris is up by 2.5 or 3. So that delta has gone from 3.5 to really just around 1%. And we've actually seen some polls that have had Baldwin underperforming Harris. To be clear, I expect Baldwin to outperform Harris by a couple of points. But if Harris does worse than we expect in Wisconsin, that could be a bad sign for Baldwin. That could mean she could lose. Now, let's take a look at the latest polling because it's broadly good for Tammy Baldwin. Now, Tip Insights, this is a more GOP-leaning pollster. They have her up by 2. Atlas Intel had her tied. CNN had her up by 2. But Insider Advantage, this is, again, a Republican-leaning pollster, but still a decent one. They have Hovde up by 1. She's up by 4 in the Marquette poll, which is a pretty solid pollster. She's up by 1 in Suffolk, 1 in Emerson, up by 1 in Quinnipiac, but she's down by 1 in this GOP internal. So you've seen that the polls have tightened. They're all within a couple of points. And on one hand, I think you could make the argument that this is because polls have begun to, really... I think like hedge their bets in terms of who's going to win, because this election I think is very close. And everyone, every election people say, oh, it's going to be close, but in 2020 we saw the polls are pointing pretty clearly in one direction. This year, with few exceptions, every poll is just saying it's a tied race, it's a toss, we don't know who's going to win. And what that means is that no one is not really a real incentive for anyone to go out there and predict a big Trump win or a big Harris win. Outside of the partisan pollsters, you're not really going to see that. So that's kind of, trickled down to the Senate races where initially Democrats were up by a lot in the polls. That gap has closed. Now, with that being said, I do think Wisconsin, this is going to apply to all these races, there's reason to be optimistic for Democrats. Tammy Baldwin has not lost that much support. She was at 50% at her peak. She's now at 49.1%. The gain has been for Hovde. Hovde was at 42, 41, 43. He's now up to 47. What I really think he's done is kind of just coalesce the Republican support, maybe undecided voters who were going to vote for Trump but weren't sure who to vote for in the Senate race. They came home for Eric Hovde. So what we're seeing now is, and I'd say it's pretty clear, is that Eric Hovde has coalesced the Republican base, and he's kind of hit the floor. So if you held the election August or early September, you could have seen him lose by 5, 6, or 7. I think now, at worst, he's going to lose by 4. So that is going to be interesting to see. I've actually been pretty high on Republicans in this race for the past month. In my Senate prediction, I actually said this race is a borderline toss-up. I'd still rather be Baldwin, but what we're seeing right now is, I'd say, exactly what I expected to see, where Tammy Baldwin is the favorite. She's the incumbent. She's 2-0 in statewide Senate races in Wisconsin. But Eric Hovde has coalesced that Republican base, and he's going to make it closer than a lot of people would have originally anticipated. Now, let's go to Pennsylvania. This, I think, is going to be really interesting. Now, we do see that there's a lot more undecided voters here than there are in Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, it's 49-47. Pennsylvania, it's 48-45. So we see that, again, around 7% of Pennsylvania voters, more than that actually, do not know who they're going to vote for in the Senate race and are going to decide likely on Election Day. And Casey was really up. He was up by 8 in the middle of August, and he's now only up by 3. Now, let's talk about the latest polling data. It's been quite good for David McCormick. He was up by 3 in the Echelon Insights poll. He's come within a couple points in Quinnipiac, Atlas Intel, and Monmouth. I think this is quite good for him. He's only down by 1. We have some better polls for Casey. He's up by 5 in Fox. He's up by 6 in the CBS poll. He's up by 6 in the UMass Lowell poll. But again, Susquehanna, this is a good local pollster. They showed only as a 3-point race. So the polls show a narrow lead for Casey. It's consistent, but it is narrow. And in 2016, we saw Democrats underperform their polls by a couple of points in Pennsylvania in the Senate race. In 2020, Biden underperformed his polls by 3.5. I'm not saying that you should use past polling error to predict the future miss. But again, in Pennsylvania, in these Rust Belt states, there is a pattern that's right, that goes in a way that favors Republicans, I'd say 2 out of every 3 times. And so Bob Casey, a 3-point lead is good for him. There's no taking away from that, but I think he'd like it to be closer to 5 for him to really be sitting pretty at this point. And again, unlike Baldwin, he's actually lost a good amount of support. He was at 50% here, right? He's fallen down to below 48. McCormick, again, he's picked up the low-hanging fruit, but it's not the same as Hovde, who really gained 5-6 points. McCormick's only really gained 3 since his really rock bottom at below 42%, and he's now at 45%. So this is, I think, actually real persuasion. And I also believe that McCormick is a better candidate than Hovde by a good amount. Obviously, Casey is a bit more of an entrenched incumbent than Tammy Baldwin. He's won more elections in Pennsylvania than Baldwin has in Wisconsin. Pennsylvania is also a state that's, I think, a shade bluer than Wisconsin. That could, a lot of people think Pennsylvania is going to vote to the right of Wisconsin this year. I don't buy it. More on that in my final presidential election prediction video coming out likely on Monday, November 4th. But to go back to the Senate race here, right, what we see here is that David McCormick is a good candidate. And I think a lot of people didn't want to say that just because it was the expectation that he was going to lose by a good amount to Bob Casey. But McCormick is a good candidate. He's running a more moderate campaign, and I don't say that because I think that he's going to be like a Lisa Murkowski type Republican who's going to break with the party often. That's not going to happen. But what I do think is that compared to, say, Bernie Moreno in Ohio or Eric Hovde in Wisconsin, McCormick's been a bit lighter on the rhetoric, which is going to help him in the suburbs, right? And what we've seen is that in district polling, Casey does a bit better than Harris in the working class areas, right? Like Scranton, Pennsylvania 8th District, or the areas outside of Pittsburgh that are more right trending. But in the Philadelphia suburbs, where Harris is going to need to do well to win the state, we could see some Harris-McCormick voters. Now, the good news for Casey is that he's a longtime incumbent, and historically he does well both in the working class areas and in the suburbs. But if we do see a ticket split this year, and one that helps McCormick, it's going to be one in the suburbs. And that is where this matters. So what's it going to be? Are we going to see McCormick do well enough with Harris voters in the suburbs to unseat Casey? I don't think so, because Casey's the incumbent. He usually does well with these voters. In 2018, he did well with these voters. And even though I think the overperformance will be bigger for him in the working class areas, he's still a good incumbent. He still outruns Harris by 3-4 points in the majority of polling. And the good polls, even though it's close, the good polls do show him ahead of McCormick. So again, I think that this race, and a lot of it does come from Republican pollsters, obviously, right? Like I think especially in Wisconsin too. Like some of the polls that have had it close, like Trafalgar and Atlas Intel, those are Republican-aligned pollsters. Echelon is a Republican-aligned pollster that is decent, but they're Republican-aligned pollsters, so obviously they do have a partisan incentive. So the average is still a bit skewed towards Republicans, keep that in mind, but the surge is real for McCormick, and I think this is kind of an upset that could really happen, potentially. So Casey's still favored to me, and I'll talk more about this in detail in my updated, in my final Senate prediction, but to me, it is pretty clear that this is going to be closer than a lot of people thought originally. So in that way, both Wisconsin and Pennsylvania are bad news for Democrats. Now, the good news for Democrats is that Michigan, to me, I'm not sure I buy the hype for Republicans in. Now, I want to preface this by saying that today I read a very interesting report from from a ranking official who is a Democrat, obviously, in Detroit, in the city of Detroit. And she estimated that turnout is going to be tens of thousands of votes higher in Detroit, the city itself, than 2020. And again, this person, I think her last name is Winfrey. I'm forgetting her first name, unfortunately, in the position she holds, which is bad for me because that's unprofessional. But again, she runs. I think she runs elections in the city, and she generally has a good feel for how the turnout is going to look. She predicted the turnout very well in 2022. She said it was going to be about 5 to 10 points lower. Then 2020 it ended up being, or then 2018 it ended up being 7 points lower than 2018, right? So that's a factor here. But what's really happening, right, is Democrats in Detroit look energized. We've seen early voting in Michigan has been pretty good for Democrats, I would say. And on top of that, which is, I'd say more importantly than early voting, the polling in Michigan is kind of stabilized. Even the Republican pollsters aren't finding good results for Trump in Michigan. CNN had Harris up by 5 in Michigan. And this is a state that Republicans have really struggled in since 2016. So on the surface, just whether you're talking about the Senate race or the presidential race, it's going to be a blue-leaning state. But let's talk about the Senate race now. Mike Rogers, Alyssa Slotkin. Rogers has caught up a little bit, but again, what we've seen is that he's really just, along with Slotkin, kind of coalesced the base here. What we saw was that at his worst point, he was down by, 5.5%, 6% here. He was down by 6%. Right, so he's gone from 41.5 to 44.7, so he's gained a little over 3%. Slotkin's been similar; she's gained a little over a point, and so there has been movement towards Rogers in this race. But at the same time, he's not the thing with Hovde is that he's at 47 as a non-incumbent. Even McCormick's at 45. Hovde, actually, to be fair to McCormick, I don't think this is all that great either. But the thing with Hovde that's really interesting is that he's cracking 47 as a non-incumbent. McCormick and Rogers not so much, and Rogers especially can't even crack 45%. Obviously, Slotkin is polling a bit lower than Tammy Baldwin. But again, she's not an incumbent, and generally, what we do see is that undecided voters tend to break towards incumbents, especially in these Senate races that are down the ballot in other races where you don't have an incumbent. It's different. So obviously, I think this is a good sign for Slotkin that she's kind of holding up in that 49% range. And again, just looking at the individual pollsters, right? Echelon Insights, the same poll that had Harris tied in Michigan and had her down by 5 in Pennsylvania. They have Slotkin up by 2. Atlas Intel, GOP-aligned firm, Slotkin up by 2. She's up by 1 in WAPO. Actually, she's up by 3 when they push undecideds, which is good for her. She's up by 5 in Fox. She's up by 6 in CNN. Emerson has her up by 2. So the good pollsters have her up by 2. Mitchell has Rogers up by 2, which I think is interesting. This is actually a decent pollster that I have a good amount of respect for, but they don't specify their number of likely voters, which is weird. The majority of the polls, Slotkin's ahead. In what we do know about the early voting, it's pretty good for Democrats. And I just broadly think that for Democrats to lose Michigan, something's going to have to go very wrong for them. And at this point in time, I'm just not sure that looks like it's materializing. And so for that reason, I'm probably going to lean towards a Democratic victory in Michigan, both for Harris and Slotkin here. Obviously, I could be wrong, but I am just broadly quite bullish on Democrats here. And Rogers, to me, that he can't crack 45%, not good for him. So let's return to this map one more time. We've got these 3 seats. Democrats need to go 3 for 3. Republicans need to just win one of them to kind of close out the night. And obviously, on the surface, that sounds good for Republicans, especially because they've had a lot of momentum in all 3 of these races as of late, especially Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. But at this point in time, I do think Democrats are still favored in all these races, and I look forward to talking more about this with you all. I believe on Sunday, I'll release my final Senate prediction. It's coming up sooner than we all think. So, again, let me know what you all want to see. Let me know what you're expecting next. We have our final days of the campaign. Make sure to go out and vote. Whether you're voting early or voting on election day, it's important that we all vote. And let me know what you all, are predicting. Obviously, I want to hear your everyone's thoughts as well. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.